here on another solo episode, and we're hitting the tariffs again. And I want to talk about why we're hitting the tariffs so hard. It is my opinion right now that we are in the middle of one of the biggest debates over trade policy that we've ever had in this country. And I think that it's going to be defining for this country moving forward. And it's going to be important not just for you to understand what the trade policy is now, but to continue to watch our trade policies moving forward. And it's one of those things, economics, in trade policy is one of those things that affects every single person, affects our day-to-day lives. It affects how much we pay for groceries, for our cars, our house. It affects everything. So I want everybody to know about this. And tariffs seem boring and trade seems boring, but it is so important that you guys understand this, and that in future elections, when trade is a bigger issue, and it's going to be after this, and in fact, in 2026, this could be the biggest issue on the table. It's going to be important for you guys to understand the nuances here. So I wanted to back up and answer a couple questions that I got from our last episode. A lot of people were assuming that we started when Donald Trump took office, the status quo was free trade, and it's not. Okay, tons of countries had tariffs on us. China had tariffs on us. They have non-tariff barriers, meaning they have like excessive regulation. And an example of that would be if we had, a cereal that was created. General Mills creates it here in the United States, and they want to sell it in Europe. And Europe arbitrarily bans the type of wheat that we grow here in America. And so then what happens is General Mills can no longer import that cereal into Europe. Some European cereal company will grow their wheat there. They will capture the market, and we have no access to it. And there's no scientific reason that American wheat would be banned from Europe, but they do it anyways just to protect their markets. That's an example of a non-tariff trade barrier. Okay. China has a couple other ones that are pretty unique to them. Their government requires that you have a Chinese company partner with you if you're going to have access to Chinese markets. What that does is it allows those Chinese portions of the company to steal American technology. So that's a big deal breaker for a lot of companies that want to move into into China. And then another big one, another big non-tariff trade barrier that is especially prevalent in China is just straight up bans of technology. And you can think about this, from an authoritarian perspective. They don't allow Facebook in China. Okay. They don't allow Twitter. They don't allow Google. They don't allow any of those products because they're an authoritarian regime, and they're afraid that if people had an idea of what life in the United States was like, that they would rebel against the CCP, and it would be the end of the Chinese government. So there's all these different rules. And all this, when China was initially brought into the World Trade Organization, I think it was in 1992, they were supposed to abide by all the World Trade Organization's rules. That meant not just jacking up these tariffs, none of those arbitrary restrictions on trade, arbitrary regulations rather. No currency manipulation. That's another way China disadvantages the U.S. in trade. They manipulate their currency. They do devalue the yuan, so that way it's cheaper to export their products here. They do all these just unfair trade practices. They shouldn't be allowed in the World Trade Organization, but they were brought in by Bill Clinton, and they shouldn't have been, and now we're having to deal with it. Donald Trump's cleaning up this mess here, or at least attempting to. This trade war is going to have a lot of different consequences, and we're going to get into that today. So the first thing I wanted to talk about too is just to reiterate again, okay? Tariffs just arbitrarily applied to countries, like this 10% base tariff that Donald Trump has put on all these other countries, that is a bad thing. Okay. When we are targeting tariffs, okay, we want to be really careful about what products we apply them to. If we just slap a 10% tariff on Brazil, okay, and they are importing bananas here, all that is going to do is raise the price of bananas. We cannot grow bananas here in the United States. There's no banana market. And so all that's going to do is hike prices up. Now, where we do want to use tariffs, okay, is let's say we have a flourishing, rice market. Okay, we can grow rice here in the United States, but we'll use another country. We'll say Vietnam. We'll say Vietnam is slightly undercutting our rice here, and they're importing product and selling it at just a little bit cheaper than what it can be produced for here in the United States. If that is allowed to continue, rice farmers will go bankrupt. All of the investment that rice farmers made in specialized equipment will be lost. They may not be able to afford the mortgage payments on their land anymore. It could cause a really big problem. And another risk is that if we were to have a war with China, they would take over Vietnam pretty quickly, and they could cut off our supply chain for rice. So we want to have domestically produced food, and we want to protect the rice industry. So what we might decide to do is put a 25% tariff on Vietnamese rice. And so now what would happen is that since the costs are going up for this Vietnamese company that's importing rice here, what they're going to do is they are going to raise their prices until it matches what domestic producers can produce rice for. Okay. And let's say that's maybe a 10% raise in price. Now what's going to happen, that 15% that's left over, because this is a 25% tariff, the Vietnamese company is going to have to eat that. Okay, they're going to have to take a hit to their margins. And most of these foreign companies can afford to do that because in Vietnam, they're producing rice for slave wages. They're making huge margins, okay, these rice companies, because they don't pay their workers anything. Because the standard of living in Vietnam is very low. And therefore, it's cheap to produce products like rice and ship it over here. So a targeted tariff like that can make a lot of sense. And so what that does actually too is if you were to extrapolate that model and say that, our American prices, they're going to go up 10% in all these areas, but we're also going to be raising 15%. Okay. Because remember, the government is getting this money there. When the rice enters our port of entry, okay, the government stands there with a handout and the producer hands them a check for 25% of what the price of that rice is. Okay. So the government is raising revenue. But remember, 15% of that burden is going to be borne by the Vietnamese company. The other 10% will be borne by the American people in the form of prices rising, okay, inflation. But consider our situation right now. We raise a lot of money through taxes, okay, domestic taxes, like income tax. We can take income tax as an example. American citizens pay 100% of the income tax. But if we were to have well-targeted tariffs, foreigners might pay over half of those taxes, okay? So if we were to completely replace the income tax, all right, with tariffs, we could put a lot of that burden on foreign countries, reducing the tax liability for Americans. If we were able to do that, and that is a huge if, and I'm going to tell you why that's going to be really hard. There are not a ton of industries where we are being just slightly undercut by foreign markets, where we have the capacity to generate that product here in the United States, okay? We have a clear way and clear target for these tariffs. For example, it's, just a couple, it would be really hard to tariff a product that is made across a lot of different countries. For example, if a product was made in France, China, Vietnam, Australia, and Mexico, we are going to have separate trade agreements with each of those different countries. And so managing the tariff rate on each one of those and keeping it in parity with our domestic industry would be really difficult. And then on top of that, making sure consumers aren't hit too hard. It's a tall order. Okay. But I can tell you the answer is not just slapping a 10% tariff on every single company or every single country. Now, and that's the current situation. As of right now, as of today, where I'm recording this on April 10th, okay, Donald Trump has backed off his crazy tariff percentages he decided to throw out there on his chart, okay? And so now what we have is we have a 90-day pause where each country is going to be facing just a 10% tariff. And there are some exceptions to products that will not be tariffed. I think gold is one of them. Automobiles are going to have a different tariff rate. Now, the big standout, though, 10% on every country except China. China, we're somewhere between 125% and 145% tariff because they retaliated and slapped more tariff on our goods. And let me tell you why China will not win this trade war. China already, their people are in a lot of debt. Okay, their economy is in a precarious position since they have a command economy. Okay, they're not a free market like us. The government will mandate housing be built in certain places, certain products be produced at certain prices, and what that creates is a lot of inefficiency. You could, look back at the Soviet Union or even, China 50 years ago to see exactly what I'm talking about. China has entire cities that have been built that nobody lives in because the government mandated that these cities be built, but there was no demand. So they sit empty. That stuff costs a lot of money. There's a lot of debt involved there and a lot of bad debt in those Chinese markets. So with China in such a precarious place, they cannot afford a trade war with us right now. And even if their economy was in a good place, we purchase billions of dollars more in products from China. So that's the trade deficit. Our trade deficit is billions of dollars with China. So if we are just going to slap tariffs tit for tat on each other, China has a lot more to lose because we buy more from them than they buy from us. Makes a lot of sense. Their country has low standards of living, low GDP per capita, and the United States is the largest consumer market in the world and to have ever existed. So this all makes a lot of sense from here. Why Donald Trump is hitting China. And the reason he's being so tough on China, number one, not only are they just an antagonist to the United States on the world stage, not only are they communists, an authoritarian regime who wants to see the fall of the United States and is behind a lot of the ill wills in the world, but China hits us with so many different trade violations, mainly stealing our technology. Okay, they commit cyber attacks against us. They've threatened our allies in the East Asian region. But the way they steal our intellectual property and how they're using it to try and surpass us in the tech industry, you could see DeepSeek AI as a pretty big example. It's the way they treat us is not fair. We keep their economy afloat. Okay, we send in that huge trade deficit, billions and billions of dollars every year to keep them afloat. Yet they attack us every chance they get. And it needs to end. Honestly, I think that any tech products that we should, trade should be shut down with China, to be honest, for these high tech products. If you want to keep, importing your t-shirts from China and your phone cases as whatever. Okay, we can deal with that. The phone case manufacturing industry isn't coming back to the United States. Sorry. It's going to move to every single country in the world before it comes back to our shores. Those cheap non-tech items, slap them with the tariff, push China around, put the squeeze on them. But let's try and work to a more free trade system with China on those small industries that are not coming back here. Okay. So what I guess I'm trying to say is I want a multi-tiered system here. Okay. And we'll start with the most harsh tier of this system, which number one is going to be for our enemies. Okay, these are places like China, like Russia, where we do not want to be trading any technology with them. Okay, because they steal our intellectual property. So if you have a history of stealing our IP, okay, no sensitive technology can be traded or invested there, period. That's tier one. The second tier is going to be protecting our industries of strategic value. So these are our industries like our weapons industries, okay, our military equipment, our agriculture, and our pharmaceuticals. All of these supply chains must be protected. So, and here's why. So during COVID, you might have remembered you couldn't get a lot of over-the-counter drugs. And that's because these over-the-counter drugs were produced in China. And then because of COVID, ports were shut down. There were all sorts of supply chain issues. But if we were to ever get in a kinetic war with China and, things got really bad, they would not keep selling us ibuprofen. Okay. Our military would need a lot of these drugs and we'd face shortages here in the United States if the supply chain stayed there in China, or even, and when I say China, I mean also countries that are right there in China's neighborhood that the U.S. would have a hard time defending. Vietnam, Southeast Asia, South Korea. I mean, even Japan, it'd be tougher for China to invade them, but it'd still be precarious to have a lot of our production there in Japan. So this second tier, this is going to be our industries of strategic value. And we want to have tariffs here to at least encourage companies to bring their supply chains to the Western Hemisphere. Okay. We could probably afford to have a large portion of our drugs made in Canada, maybe even Mexico or some Central American countries. Okay. Because militarily, we could go defend those supply chains pretty easily from an adversary like China. And if we can't defend those supply chains there, we have bigger problems than a shortage of ibuprofen. Okay, so that's our second, tier of strict tariffs. I think those tariffs should be high, and they should be high enough to force companies to move back here to the Western Hemisphere, if not within our borders. Okay. The third tier is the tier that I just talked about, where it could make economic sense to, and when I say economic sense, what I mean is that our government could raise more revenue from these tariffs, outweighing not only the deadweight loss, meaning the value that is lost when you raise taxes on a product, and people can't afford it now. So neither the product is ever sold, ever bought, nor the tax ever collected. And so when that's the quick definition of deadweight loss. But if those if the deadweight loss is taken into account, the inflation of the price is taken into account, yet the government revenues still outweigh those drawbacks. Okay. And I don't just mean a little bit, but I mean in a way where the government could substantially lower our taxes and compensation so that we can then afford those higher prices. I think we should go for it. And I understand that these scenarios are few and far between. And some economists feel that you'd be stepping over a dollar to pick up a penny by pursuing these trade policies, especially if you take into account that we would be facing reciprocal tariffs there. But if we can come up with a few of these scenarios that raises a lot of revenue for the government, protects our foreign industry, protects domestic industry, protects domestic workers, I think we should take it. I think we should take that opportunity, because why not? I mean, and especially if we can, come up. And let me give you an example of a country that should accept this without retaliatory tariffs. Let's take Poland, for example. We subsidize Poland's defense. Okay, they're in NATO. We contribute the vast majority of NATO funds. Okay, and it's mainly for defense of countries like Poland. Okay. Russia would have to march all the way through Europe before they were ever a military threat to us. And I understand they have nukes, but let's put the nukes aside for a second, because there's a lot of military concerns that don't involve the nuclear weapons. If we're going to just start launching nukes, the world's over and it doesn't matter anyways. But NATO is for countries like Poland. Okay. They benefit the most because they're at the most risk. Okay. And they're not even contributing that much to the alliance to begin with. So a country like that should accept that we are going to place tariffs on them when we find it economically viable, and they shouldn't be retaliating, because that's part of our compensation for contributing the most to Europe's defense and to each individual country's defense. Okay. And I understand these tariffs. Okay. Some economists will tell you, tariffs are just like punching yourself in the face. These tariffs, they're always bad. No tariff is good. And that just is not true. There are scenarios where a tariff can have a net benefit to the country implementing them, because we can claw back so much producer surplus from these companies abroad that have such cheap labor costs. And when I say producer surplus, what I'm talking about is, if you're looking at a demand curve, okay, it's, you're looking at a chart of supply and demand. You can look this up if you want to see it here. Everything, underneath the, where price, if you're looking underneath the equilibrium price, okay, there's this whole shaded section between zero, the demand curve, and what or the supply curve rather, and what the equilibrium price is. There's this whole area, and it's called producer surplus. Okay. And the easier way to think about it is it's this whole area is where the producer would be comfortable selling their product that is cheaper than the price they're actually able to sell it at. So let me give you an example here. So if Vietnam was trying to sell us rice, okay, and their costs are really low, it only costs them, let's say, $1 to produce a bag of rice, and we're willing to sell it, or they're willing to sell it, okay, for that $1 to break even. That's where their line's going to be, this $1. But in the United States, everything's expensive, so they're able to sell it for $4 here, okay? That $3, the 4 minus the 1, that's the producer surplus. Okay, that's how much they're profiting from having access to our markets. If we are able to claw back a chunk of that $3, it will offset the rise in the price for us, and it will offset the deadweight loss. And I know these terms are a little confusing without charts to look at, but you can Google them. You can Google, demand curve. You can Google equilibrium price, producer surplus. Check these things out. There is a scenario where it is a net benefit to our government. Okay, because these companies are making money hand over fist. Okay, they pay their people slave wages, and then they have access to our markets. Okay, and they mark it up 400, 500, 600%, sell to us, and they live like kings in their third world country. There's 100 of their workers that live in mud huts, and then they've got a mansion. And these markets weren't, built there in Vietnam. They weren't built in Cambodia. They're not rich because of, their domestic policies. They're rich because they have access to our markets. And we just shouldn't allow that anymore. But the big but, those opportunities, again, are fleeting. You are not going to replace the entire revenue from the income tax with these tariffs, and blanket tariffs on every single product don't make any sense. Okay. This topic's nuanced. I wish this was one of those things I could tell you. It's either all bad or it's all good. You listen to Trump, tariffs are all good. You listen to, leftists and economists that hate them, tariffs are all bad. Neither one of those is true. Okay, you will see prices go up if these tariffs stick around. I don't think they will. I think he's using them to negotiate better trade deals for us. Because again, a lot of these foreign countries already had tariffs on our products. So I think Donald Trump is serving the correct end here, that we are going to be, by the end of this, in a world with more free trade than we started with. But this road might get bumpy. And if more of these countries like China call our bluff, prices are going to go up here. And I read a couple articles by some economists that they would like to see Donald Trump use NATO and foreign aid more instead of threatening tariffs in order to get tariffs reduced across the world, because then at least if we do have to follow through with our threats, our prices won't go up. We'll just save money on our government's balance sheet by not giving, Tajikistan $2 billion for their transgender Sesame Street. But there's a lot of truth to that. I think that's a fair argument, but you'd have a hard time finding leverage like that for China. Okay, they're not in our military alliance. It is a purely transactional relationship we have with them, and so I think tariffs are just unfortunately going to be the tool of choice there. And I don't think we've even really gone far enough for China, to be honest with you guys. So let's. I really think that's about it. I'm going to stay on this topic with you guys, and hopefully this is the last episode of just tariffs. We can go back to just covering it in little portions of these episodes, but it's just so important. I want you guys to understand why prices may be going up and why this topic is so important. I think, again, it is going to be one of the most important topics moving forward. And I wish more people cared about trade and economics, but this is the issue of our time right now. It's the biggest conversation we've had about trade in a very long time. I think it's worth having. We got to talk about it. We got to read about it. We got to bounce ideas off each other. And the last thing that I do want to point out here is economics is a burgeoning field, guys. If you see somebody on TV stand up and tell you, they know exactly what's going to happen if we do X, Y, and Z things in our economy, most of the time they're bullshitting you, unless it's just like, one of the most obvious principles. If you're dealing with something as complicated as tariffs, I mean, you are not going to find somebody that can tell you with 100% certainty they know what's going to happen here, because they don't. And that goes for the Trump administration too. They don't know that this is really going to work out. But what I can tell you is the status quo isn't working out, and we got to do something different. We got to try something. So I think that there is some solid foundation here, some solid economic theory for some of these tariffs, and there just isn't for others. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. I'm rooting for more free trade here, and for us to really, hit China hard enough to where they fall back in line and stop ripping us off all the time. So I'm out. That's an episode. Thanks, guys.